Greetings, friends out there in the land of Twitch. Have a topical tavern chat tonight, as seems to be the norm for Wednesday nights. Welcome to everyone joining us now, watching later, chatting, lurking. Get the usual stuff out of the way. From the Tomes, Twitch TV from the Tomes. Right here, where you can connect with the finest minds in gaming, or at least the people who tune in on my channel, who very well could be the finest minds in gaming. Fox and Board Games at YouTube, foxandboardgames.com for all the landing base for all the updates, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Fox and Board Games. Big thank you to everyone who likes and subscribes and follows and does all those things to any of these media outlets. That's why I keep doing it. I'll take a moment to mention I have another episode of this uploading at the moment. But over last weekend,
and learned that a gladiator in town that has a lot of business
debuted our first recorded playthrough of a game of Tales of the Harrowed Land. See a little bit over here.
handlings happened to
See me being the uncomfortably strange merchant.
And like when he mentioned the gladiator, his face goes from a kind of strange rhinoceros grin.
Turn that down a little bit. So this is our latest offering up at the YouTube channel. We'll be having another one of these appear from the past weekend before this coming weekend, probably tomorrow night, I think, assuming everything goes well. I'm in the process of uploading it now. So it's a long play, about 2 hours and 20 minutes. This scenario is very talky. It was a lot of information gathering, a lot of talking to NPCs, a lot of trying to find out pieces of puzzles and determine how and where things are going to go. And it actually feeds very much into tonight's topic of information flow. Drop the work share. I'm not seeing the chat. It did this to me yesterday. So maybe because it was full screened. Where's my chat screen? There it is. So that was kind of our latest offering, and I've been building up to that for a couple weeks. And I've been kind of hinting about something that was coming down the pike up at the webpage and up at the YouTube channel, and that's the first of it. That is our very fun game sessions shot with an owl cam, minimally edited enough to make it watchable, but I didn't really remove much in the way of content. Parental advisory is in place. Viewer discretion is advised. It is a bit of a scenario that involves a rather gruesome murder. And some of the descriptions are a bit intense. And in fact, the group after this one portion this past week said, "Yeah, you're putting a viewer content warning on this, right?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." I said, "It's a little much." I mean, again, after having read, written, and watched horror for most of my life, to me, it's not that over the top. But I guess to the average person who plays D&D and kind of killing a cartoon kobold, and I don't know what they say as far as graphic description in their games, but the description of a human being murdered and mutilated in a very kind of serial killer like fashion, I guess is a lot for some people. So let's get up a visual aid here. It's always fun to have stuff in the background. Any old people watching this, which I think is most of my viewership, will enjoy this. I think. Maybe it'll be flashed back. Maybe it'll be traumatized. I don't know. But this kind of feeds into our first topic. Yeah, I mean, there's all varying grade. You guys aren't done with the story yet either, so it might get worse as it goes on. But, again, I'd rather just not start this with people getting upset because there's a description of a grisly murder with psychosexual overtones, and you find out somebody watching it has been deeply traumatized by it. I'd rather just not do that. So I guess we'll find out. So tonight's topic, it is not going to be as broadly accessible. As I've already said to a few people, it might not even be an extensively long chat. I had a rather limited interest, I think, in it. I think maybe because people didn't exactly know how it could apply to them or what it was. The last two chats were really rousing, kind of not only game enthusiasts, but folklore enthusiasts. A few writers I know actually watched the broadcast after the fact and have gone and watched it on YouTube. And it was a pretty big viewership for the last 2 weeks for this particular chat. And the days following each one, I had an amazing turnout for people to come and talk about it further or just watch me work. And of course, I'm thrilled, I'm flattered. But I wanted to dial it back this week, mainly just to give something that was more specifically gamer, maybe even game design theory oriented. I mean, I don't want to make this I really don't want to make this one of my classrooms, but I think there's some interest there in terms of how I organize scenarios and what goes into organizing scenarios. And I plan a longer chat on this. And right before I came on, Curzon asked, well, how about also giving like a kind of a counterbalance, a player perspective? And I think it's a great idea, and I think I'll probably do something like that. But I think that actually becomes an even longer and bigger topic. This is one, I joke around and say that all of our, especially those topics that we cover on this, that deal with this kind of social context to gaming or deal with a social aspect of gaming. I always say, well, this is really big. This is just scratching the surface. I mean, we can go back and discuss culture. We can go back and discuss religion. We can go back and discuss, the development of individual components of a game like Magic. These were all things that were very big popularity wise. So I think there's still a lot of room, but I decided to just dial this back. So as always, feel free to chat. Feel free to just lurk. Say hi. Greetings. A few more people just popped on the stream, so hello and thank you for joining. So there's Wolfie. Hey, well, no worries. Not my classroom. You can be as late, or you can leave as early as you want. You can even eat during class if you want. Hello, Neil. So, yeah, that's the funny thing. Like, I've had a couple people write me and apologize for missing a chat. I'm like, I really appreciate that, but, hey, this is your time as much as it is mine. Thanks for popping on. Thanks for coming. So, I think the crux of what I'm getting at tonight is, and this came up in discussion this week, or the end of last week during one of my writing sessions, like, how do you convey information to players, right? And I think that is yet still another topic, this idea of how to feed out information to players and how to organize yourself as a game master, and especially in a non-linear scenario, like how do you get the players to even understand what's going on and access it? And I think I wanted to kind of prelude that by organizing my thoughts on different types of scenarios. And I guess we're going to start with the first and most obvious. It's map based. It's location based. Right? This is kind of the most venerable form of the game and of tabletop gaming. And of course, I think this also comes off of the war game roots, right? This is happening on a map. These things happen in locations. Specific things happen when you get to a specific location. We saw it, and we've seen it in every game we've run. But I'm thinking, especially in terms of the D&D Curzon ran the last couple weeks. Hey, man. Hey, Justin, how's it going? Good to see you. I mean, I've had pleasure seeing you in person for 2 weeks, but good to see you online. So, I think, this we saw it in the game Curzon ran the past couple weeks. If the couple people who've played my more straight up D&D type games, or even the last Tales game I ran. I mean, it was a very typical kind of campaign layout in that you had location-based scenes, location-based encounters, location-based events. In that case, it was an overland adventure, so there were these transitional moments of moving across the landscape. Yeah. So that's a really good point there, Wolfie. And I was actually thinking that as I started talking, I was actually thinking, though, when I'm at the table, it's not like I pull out a giant map. Well, I mean, I'm lying. Actually, I do. Especially if I run D&D and I run it in Greyhawk. I like to unfold my vintage Greyhawk maps and put them out and do the Indiana Jones thing of the characters, traversing the landscape from one place to another. I find, though, that if you're in any kind of combat-intensive interior, the Keep on the Borderlands, right? The Temple of Elemental Evil, any of these places, you are kind of moving from place to place in managing the encounter. Oh, good. Glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, glad you enjoyed it. So that's actually a Sunday game, but yeah, it showed up over the weekend, so it might have looked. It was the previous week's game. This week's will be out tomorrow night. In fact, with any luck, it should be uploading as I speak. And it says 27% uploaded to YouTube, so let's see. We'll see if by the end of the chat it's close. But yeah, so we do a Thursday night game in which somebody else has been running recently. Neil has run Warhammer, Curzon's did some D&D, and Blake is going to resume D&D this week now that his back is better and he can actually sit for lengths of time. So he had an injury about 6 weeks ago, so hopefully he'll be up for running. But in most of these kinds of encounters, you're transitioning, and what you encounter is based on the map. Now, okay, maybe you don't have the map laid out on the table. Maybe the game master describes it. Maybe you're old school and you draw it out. Like I've got a battle map, and I've got a couple battle maps, all thanks to other people giving them to me. Like Fran, one of our other players, who just showed up with one after our third game session, was like, I think we need this. And I was like, yeah, okay. So we did a battle map. I do the battle map, dry erase battle map, as we go along, as needed, per encounter. And the old school way, and I joked about this, is what did we used to do? The corridor goes up 30 feet, and there's a right and a left T intersection. Turn it a T intersection. You made the players draw it out. And that was always interesting, too, because if they misinterpreted it, well, their map was wrong. The player map was wrong, and the character map was wrong. And I always thought that was really interesting. I'd be curious to know how many new groups are doing that, especially with younger players, what the attention span is for something like that. Oh yeah, that's how I did it through up until comparatively not that long ago. And I think there's still merit to that if you want to simulate the idea of getting lost in a dungeon. I think that's kind of a cool thing. Now, obviously, especially in the newer versions of the game, where positioning can be very important for certain abilities, can be important for certain modifiers and advantages, the map comes out, right? Some sort of combat map with miniatures or markers or whatever comes out. And there's always something exciting, I think. Now, I love maps too, so I really love drawing maps. I haven't taken the time to do some of the ones for Tales to the degree that I would like to. I've done a few, but I really want to spend some time and make some cool maps. And I'm absolutely thrilled with the idea of unveiling cool maps. Having said that, I think gaming-wise, I'm not so sure how many people are running intensively map based encounters at this point. I feel that probably even if they're dealing with a dungeon environment or they're dealing with some sort of situation in which the characters are going to have to navigate obstacles, that they often are doing in a much more narrative flow sense, much more theater of the mind's eye sense, which I also like very much. I mean, again, I don't think any of these are wrong or right. I think they're just very different. So you've got these map based, and how you manage this as a game master is very straightforward, right? The characters get to here, and when they get to here, this occurs. The ogres attack. They hear screams from the next room. The magic user falls through a secret door, right? These are all things that are going to happen when they get to that location. It kind of gives the illusion of navigating a space. I think. Let's see. So there's the OSR segment of gaming, and it's funny. I've had a lot of people say, "Is Tales an OSR game?" And I'm like, "Well, I haven't really thought about categorizing it, whether it's OSR or what they call new school gaming." I don't really. I think it's definitely got storytelling and narrative elements. The very fact that the font looks like the front of an Iron Maiden album, I think denotes it as having this old school sword and sorcery feel, which is exactly what I was going for. This pulp fantasy, sword and sorcery, Robert E. Howard, John Carter on Mars type of look and feel to it, and that's all been very intentional. So I think, and it's interesting that so Neil, this is something that I know you have a lot of experience with, and I don't have as much experience with the newer games. But like the very narrative driven games and story beat driven games. I mean, are there even maps? Do they even use a mapping element? And I would be interested to know that, whether it comes into play or not, whether it's even necessary in that style of gaming. I don't know. Again, I don't like. I remember the game Heart that you ran. I mean, a map wasn't even part of the plan, from what I understood of the game. That the whole point was that it was this fluid, almost stream of consciousness experience. Yeah, and I think it really does. I agree. I think it really does depend on the group too. I know that most of my players for the in person group, even though generationally about half of them are extremely. Okay. Interesting. So yeah, we never got that impression. Maybe if we played it longer, played it offline, maybe I would have gotten a different impression of it. A quick start to crossover. Okay. All right. So yeah. So if you're playing the game in full, then the map is actually very important. That's kind of cool because I didn't perceive it as that, and I walked away thinking it was a very kind of surrealist game. I was like, I don't know what just happened. It was very much like watching Sienna and Delu or some of this, or a Lynch movie where these things were kind of just happening, and I'm not sure exactly what's real and what's not, and not that that bothers me, but it's a very different type of feel to a game. So, Wolfie, that's a good point because though my current playing group, my week to week playing group, at least half of either the larger group or the smaller group that's playing now are generationally in a different place than I am as far as RPGs. They didn't have the old school experience for the most part. They really want the map. They really want the map to root where they are in the game world, and especially in combat, to help visualize location, visualize obstacles, general scale of foes. And I know D&D and Pathfinder have really gone back to maps and miniatures and hexes and squares being these really important components to the game itself. I have a mixed feeling about that, honestly, but I understand how and why it works in these newer versions of these games. And I think it's also makes it a little more accessible. Like I've had players, younger students, I'm thinking, players who relate to it entirely as an extended board game, versus a deep role playing section, a deep role playing experience. That's also an interest. That's also coming from video games. That's a maturity thing. They don't have deep characters. They, have characters with +6 armor and +54 swords, and Count Strahd turns into Tyrannosaurus and they kill it, and that's like an actual example. So again, their idea of a fun D&D game at this point is far removed from where I'm at with running these games, which is, hey, have fun killing Strahd having turned into a Tyrannosaurus. I don't know if PJ's on tonight, but I guess he wouldn't. I guess he would say that it's no weirder than Strahd is normally. We had a discussion about him last week. So this moves then on to situational. Let's see. So I think it depends on the type of game, and I think this goes back to what we were just saying. I really like maps if there's 5 or 6 enemies, or 5 or 6 players and 10 enemies on the board, or even 6 enemies on the board. I'd like to know where everybody is, because I don't want to get halfway through a move and have a game master say, "Oh no, but you really can't hit him and see him from there." And I understand that also, again, it boils down to the personality of the group and the style of the game master and the flow of the description and the completeness of the description. But I agree it's an accessibility aid. And I think that's something a lot of us tend to sometimes neglect too. That certain learning styles can only perceive things in certain, how should I say, people who, certain encoding styles, content encoding styles, can only synthesize something if they see a map component, if they see a visual component. I hang out with a lot of artists. They're not auditory learners. They are not good at getting things from an auditory description. If they don't have a visual aid, they don't know what's going on. And I think that is just an encoding type. And I think that is something that maps really help with. And again, I even like to have maps to say, even a loose map of, here's the landscape, there's this city, there's this city. Because I think it helps people relate to the scale. But different groups. Now, I played Vampire with various groups for years. And Peach was among these groups, and Blake was among these groups. And Neil, I think, even played a little bit with us, where we never used maps. I mean, that was all theater. That was all just descriptive prose. But I think that comes to the next type of game, or category of this sort of thing. And by the way, these are arbitrary. I've not codified these. I haven't written a book on it yet. Maybe I will. Who knows? Situation or situation-based games in which the locales are effectively mutable, right? So this is, and the current Tales game is, I mean, it's somewhat location based. Let's see. Yeah. Well, that's a whole other discussion, and I've had this discussion with dealing with some of my younger players who don't read or have never been readers for any one of a number of reasons. That's not a dig. That's just the reality. That they're not, and also, for example, one of my players who's an avid reader, she has a lot of trouble processing gaming text, like rule text. Like she said, like it just looks like a wall of text to me. But she'll sit down and read a novel, So it's not a case. I think it's just a case of being used to processing certain types of information. Now, some of us have been doing this for a very long time and been reading game books since we were like 8 or 9 years old. So again, there is something, I think, once you kind of have that encoded, it's easier for you to translate. Having read as an early age, I tend to think, and read game books as well, I think I'm a little quicker sometimes. But I don't think that's always entirely true. I think some people, an auditory learner or a visual learner, will just process differently. But then there's situation-based games, right? Where the situation is not necessarily tied to a location or tied to a map. I mean, it could be, like, for example, and again, I'm going to try not to spoil too much of the game, but if you watch any of the playthroughs, you're going to see some of the current scenario. So I advise Neil and Blake to not watch them, though I sent them over as links. You know, if you want to actually play the scenario, you might not want to watch the playthroughs. Which maybe I should put that in the description of the scenarios. Let's see. Yes, I would agree with that, Neil. That there's definitely a different type of reading involved in a game text. Yeah, we talked about that. I don't see the apple, I just hear the word apple. And yeah, and I agreed. And that's a different way of processing information, different way of thinking. And yeah, like you can't imagine that right now I have this whole movie playing in my head. Like literally this whole movie just in the past 10 seconds about apples and movies and everything just went through my head. Um, and world maps do help with immersion. And I talk about this in my big world building map making video that's on the YouTube, the more staged one, that I think they do help with immersion. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I understand that people come from all different perspectives in terms of how they visualize or don't visualize, or how they see things or how they don't see things. But I think it is still an interesting idea that we have this kind of map heavy genre that's happening, but then we still have these situation based games. And how do you organize the information for a situation based game? With apples running down the tracks, yeah. Actually, I was just picturing apples just appearing, like almost this kind of zoetrope, like this kind of old cinema type of apparition of apples as I saw apples coming up. I kind of wish I could extract all those things that are in my head and put them out there on a visual medium. I know some of you who have heard some of them are very happy that I can't. But it's like, man, I could make a whole movie right now if I could just like transfer it out. I believe there was an entire William Gibson story about this, or something very similar. Yep, it's okay. Neil's perfectly fine not knowing every visualization that comes into my head being it real in front of his eyes. He loses D20 sanity when he looks at it. Soon he is in the asylum with the proto Shoggoth. So the situation based stuff, and I transition quite fluidly into the asylum scenario from Call of Cthulhu, though that is distinctly location based. I mean, a lot of those types of games, like mystery type games, they're situational, and maybe they have this environment. This. I mean, obviously they have this imaginary environment. That's what makes it a role playing game, right? But they don't necessarily have a location based environment. I mean, maybe they're time based, but they don't even necessarily have to be. They could just be situations that are happening independently of geographic locales, such as you have to find or stumble into a conversation. Where you find and stumble into the conversation in the context of the game isn't important. It's not an orc tribe that lives in this cave. That orc tribe does, this conversation does not necessarily occur in that cave, but the players have to be privy to this conversation. I think this is one of the more unusual and more abstract styles of gaming, and I'm not sure where that falls into the makeup of these games, but I know the delivery system of it can be more difficult. I mean, I think at this point it almost has more of the communicative context of a LARP, maybe. That, yeah, I mean, part of the LARP, the location is the immersion, right? That was always the kind of the funny thing about, like, vampire LARPs. Like, oh yeah, we have 200 vampires. There are only like 1,000 vampires in the world, and 200 of them are gathered in a hotel in New Jersey, right? I mean, that was always kind of the joke of that it was like, all right, how many grand conclaves are being held in the hotel rooms of New Jersey, or Philadelphia, or wherever. So I think that's always an interesting kind of way to think about it. And that in these sorts of scenarios, situation is totally the situation is not at all rooted to the environment. Now, I think for organization, most of us still think of this as being placed in a specific environment. Like if you're gonna overhear an argument between the victim and the killer at some point, or the victim and the would-be killer at some point, it's probably going to happen in the basement. You're probably going to walk by the basement door and hear it. But you don't necessarily need to. Like, it could happen anywhere. So how does the organization of this differ? How would anyone out there organize this? If you were going to prepare this, what do you do to write it up? And I found that what I do is I generally start off with a list of things that the players have to encounter to get through an environment. And again, I think we talked, and Neil brought up sandbox games earlier, and I don't know if necessarily this applies, and I qualify sandbox as being slightly different. But these situation-based games, how many of you out there have played in games like this that are situationally based, but not necessarily, events are not necessarily tied to locations, where that a certain event or situation has to occur, but when and where it occurs tends to be a little more immutable in terms of the plot. And it's more about the information that this situation delivers to the players that's really important. It's kind of quizzical, right? I mean, I know I've run a few things where I have, just for example, you have to overhear this conversation. And when and where that happens becomes almost arbitrary on my part, or maybe there's a trigger to it. Maybe the players have to have done something for this conversation to occur, but it doesn't necessarily matter when and where. Or for this creature to attempt to crawl out of the shadows and kill somebody, it doesn't necessarily matter when or where, but it's based on some kind of event trigger, we'll call it. Now, I know this is a pretty common thing in online video games, right? World events and things like that tend to happen like when a certain player threshold is reached. So I think that's a way to think about it. It is kind of moving the cheese, right? It is kind of moving the goal so that the players definitely at some point are able to access that information. They're able to find the hidden dagger, right? They have to find the hidden dagger. And I'm wondering how many I've seen some very encapsulated games like at conventions and things like that are run in this fashion. And I couldn't even tell you systems, or if they are very loose systems that people were operating off of. But these scenarios, I think, tend to be the least common, because I think that it's much harder for both game masters to design them and for a lot of players to access them, especially if they're coming from a much more standard dungeon crawl, hex crawl, bug hunt type of scenario where there's this environment that they have to interact in and affect. I don't know, but it's something I've encountered. Like the last Call of Cthulhu scenario, the Old West game, which I referenced quite a bit. There were quite a few event-based things that happened, but the players had to go do something first. For example, when the bandits raided the town, the bandits / cultists, the Desperado gang / cultists came into the town, was entirely contingent on when the players began to get close to finding out that the head of one of the mining companies was also, in fact, a cultist. It was this cause and effect type of thing, and they had to do the work to get to that point, and I had to make sure they had clues to get to that point, that they would eventually do that, because that's what then led them to chase the bandits who make off with the ore, the magic ore that had been mined, that got them to the smelting plant, to the stamp plant, the stamp mill, that blew up. That propelled the rest of the scenario. And in retrospect, the scenario was absolutely the best in its prelude, up until the point that the stamp mill blew up. I think after that, it became a little more diffused. I thought that it was very well organized. So I think it went from event-based and time-based, which we'll talk about next, to more sandbox after the explosion. And I think that's when it ran into problems. Let's see. So, Wolfie, that's really interesting because I'm struggling with that right now in a scenario that I'm working on, that something's going to happen unless the characters can stop it, right? Now, that's really hard to manage. Now, I don't think anyone here played in the pen and paper vampire game that I ran several times at conventions a long time ago. But they had to stop an Archon from killing a wrongly accused vampire. I say I ran this, I'm not going to say 9 times out of 10, because 9 times out of 10 would be a fallacious statistic. I think I ran this 4 times, and I think only one group managed to stop it. So it's a much harder type of game to run and play. So, yeah. If you miss something, you miss it. And it was interesting because what I had one of the players say at the end of that scenario that I ran, where that occurred and they had failed, they were like, you had a lot of balls failing us. You know, you had a lot of balls letting us fail. I was like, but that was the point of the scenario. You know, and it was really interesting to have a player say that to me because they were so used to, especially at a convention, nobody ever got killed because you were paying to play the game, and nobody failed because you were paying to play the game. And I see that now kind of having filtered into like some of the live action and larger scale stuff, that pretty much all failure and death is consensual. And I get it. I get it because the point is telling a collaborative story. The point is not a power contest between players. Unlike some of the old school LARPs, you know, where people's vampire characters were getting staked and torched and ultraviolet lighted and holy faith like left and right. Oh, yeah. I had convention games that were absolute just slaughterhouses. Yeah, I played those. This was years ago. These were not inexperienced players. Yeah, and I think it's okay for players to fail in a scenario. I think sometimes your best games or your best follow-up games come out of when the players feel really hosed. Like when they feel really beaten up and they're like, man, I mean, honestly, I fully think like, I was gonna say, I think part of the fun of Curzon's game was being absolutely convinced this past week that we were all going to die. Like I was fully convinced of it. You know, I was like, if 2 of us get out of here, it's gonna be really lucky, and it probably won't be me because I'm single-mindedly just gonna attack whatever's there. And the failure should be fun and spectacular, right? And I think that also goes into the temperament of players. Like, I think players that want to tell a narrative and experience a narrative are much more invested in this event type of game where their characters might fail. And like I said, I got the feeling at the end of the last Call of Cthulhu scenario, at least 2 of the players had a lot of trouble with this idea that they had not fully succeeded. Now, first of all, it's Call of Cthulhu. The fact that we lost 3 players, and the fact that we only lost 3 players out of like 3 characters, not players. Well, anyway, 3 characters out of 12 weeks, let's say, of playing is pretty amazing. I was being pretty nice, because I really like the characters. So I think that's also a thing where they were not really prepared for a scenario, especially because my D&D games tend to be very heroic, And I don't think failures, and so Curzon, you've seen a lot of failures at con tables, and I think that's okay. I think that's good, and I think it's healthy, and I think it just really depends on the game. It depends on the players. Depends on the game demographics. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Even in Call of Cthulhu, I really try, unless it's a scenario that I've built for an encapsulated situation, and I make it clear that this scenario has a high death toll. This scenario, you will go insane or die if you do the wrong things. If it's part of a longer game, I even with that really try to make the deaths of the characters significant. I try to make, exceed if you think of H.P. Lovecraft stories. Characters didn't die just from like getting tetanus from cutting their finger from opening a secret door in an old house. Like that would not be fun or exciting. And absolutely like, and I've talked about this and I'm not going to reiterate it, but there was one vampire game years ago where the game master killed my character, and it was literally this character I'd already been playing for years, and it was simply one bad die roll. And there was nothing fun about it. There was nothing heroic about it. There was, yeah, he died of dysentery. Yeah. There was nothing cool about dying in this fashion. I was just annoyed. And I wasn't annoyed that I lost my character. I was annoyed that it was basically done in this trivial fashion. And there was, in this character, it was all bad die rolls. It was all the horrendous, stupid seconded White Wolf rolling system, where if you had more dice, you were more likely to fail the stupid roll. That's what it was. It was like, because I got more ones, my character just died that I developed for years. And I was like, there was nothing fun about that. Like, there was nothing interesting. If this character had died because he had charged, burned his willpower and charged back into the building to save his friend or whatever, you know. Yeah, that was definitely odd. And I kind of walked away. I mean, it was very Call of Cthulhu. It was very Call of Cthulhu. But I don't think the player thought that I would really be like, well, you're just dead. I mean, I tried to make it really clear. I described it as the cold of outer space and a rotted smell. And I was kind of and I was kind of like I mean, you've literally with no real preparation or precaution just dove into this, you know, you dove into the portal to Yuggoth. I can say it now that the scenario is over. You dove into the portal to Yuggoth. Like there's no way your character can survive that. So it was, yeah, it was pretty rough. It was pretty rough. And the other player that more or less died. I mean, I said her character basically was saved because the other characters were trying so hard to save her, but the character would never really be played effectively again. The doctor, she had half her face blown off by an explosive. I mean, again, in Call of Cthulhu, you don't just heal from that in 2 weeks like you do, or 2 days like you do in D&D. Yeah, if it's down to just trivial luck and that kind of stuff, I think it just is sucky. Oh yeah, we have two more styles to get. I'm enjoying all the talk, by the way, and all the chat. I'm not rushing anything along. But we can keep talking. I just want to cover these other things. So time based. So then there's time based games where things happen on a timeline, independent of the players. Now that I've done fairly frequently, and in most of my modern or mystery type games, this is how it's laid out. That it is so the current Tales of the Hard Land game is very situational. I mean, I have locations where things occur, but the reality is it's a murder mystery and uncovering clues is the important part. And if I have to, the clues can be found elsewhere. Like the situation can move and can be mutable. Now there are a couple rooted environments. There are a couple rooted encounters. And like I even told you at the end of the last game, I put the figure that became the obstacle of the scenario in that location when originally I didn't even have them in that location. And because the players were so excited to try something if they found the person, I'm like, all right, let's put it there. Let's see what happens. That's a case where the situation and the end result was the same. There was originally another way to get to the end information that you did. But I was like, you know what? They're so excited for this to occur. Like, why would I not give them the opportunity to even see if this happens? Now, again, I didn't anticipate that there might have been courses of actions that might have ended up in a really, really deadly scenario. So I'll have to keep that in mind for running the game in the future. Well, right. And again, in Call of Cthulhu, there are certain situations the characters get in, like being transported to, the Ghoul Warrens, like, how many 100 kilometers below Earth, below that you're just never actually going to get out. Like I knew that there was no way the character would ever get out. But again, that's also Call of Cthulhu, and I have a little bit less issue in that game of kill, even though he was a really cool character, and that really sucked. And it wasn't the end of the scenario either. But then we have time-based stuff where things happen on a timeline. And we can argue that situation and time-based event, the time-based games and situation-based games are more or less, or they can be interpreted as the same thing. I'm not sure if I really feel that they are the same thing. Um, I I tend to think that time-based is it occurs whether or not the characters are there. It occurs whether or not the characters are successful or unsuccessful, or maybe if they're successful, so they could change the timeline. But there are events that are going to happen whether or not the players are directly involved, the characters are directly involved. And the characters may have to deal with the aftermath. They may have to deal with the impact of it. They may have been able to prevent it if they had moved quickly enough. And that's the scenario like what Wolfie was just talking about in terms of um, getting to getting to somebody to stop something before it happens. You can work time based into that, and I think that that would work fairly well. And I actually think time based is easier than situational. I think it's much easier. I mean, it can be maybe more of a downer for players because maybe they feel like, oh well, no matter what I do, it doesn't matter. And I have gotten that. I have gotten that when I've run scenarios that are distinctly time based. I do think you need a little of both. I think especially in the situationally based games, I think you need a little bit of both. I don't think that having it be entirely character event motivated is necessarily helpful because there's times when the characters are, which having been both a player and a game master when this occurs, the players just are never going to catch on and do what you need them to do, right? And you have to have something occur. You have to have this occur to move to the next step. But the big thing to keep in mind is both of these are not necessarily location focused, right? They're not necessarily and doing nothing is also doing something. Now, I have encountered in more than one scenario like players who just won't do something. I mean, we saw this again on last Thursday night where there was an event that really was supposed to occur to move the scenario on, and I was that at that moment that problem player who was just like, my character would in no way, shape, or form do that. So of course Curzon, being a wise DM, had another way that this could happen, and he admitted that this was kind of a flaw of the scenario as it was written, because it wasn't something he wrote, that the players had to do something that was totally counterintuitive to every Dungeons and Dragons game you would have played before, and no player in their right mind. Now we had temporary characters for this scenario, so I had resolved that if we really had to do that thing that seemed crazy and we all got killed doing it, okay, we did, not big deal. But if these were campaign characters that I had invested this significant amount of time in, you could bet I would have been like, there's no way my character's gonna do that. That's just like thinking we're gonna do that is not even being reasonable. And again, that's sometimes where I think, especially like some of these pre-constructed scenarios, just don't think about the reality of how players are going to react to given situations. And I think the difficulty in time-based scenarios is making players. I know the first time I ran it, so the first Call of Cthulhu game I ran for my group, which actually was the one that I've said is one of the more successful games I've run, was very time based and situation based. It was all three, but it was actually time based because I had actually set a timer on the game. I'd set a timer on the scenario within a certain number of days. Something big was going to happen. And in this case, it was nothing the players could really stop because it was a natural event. But even within that, there was a especially like we were almost so that's an interesting point. That's really interesting there, Wolfie, because that actually ties in with the other Tales game that I run, where the characters all start out as slaves, and it is clear though the point of the scenario is for them to not be slaves anymore. They have a way of doing it. They have a method of doing it and a plan to do it. So it's one of those things. But yeah, like yeah, just suppose you set this up as the slave rebellion scenario, and all the characters just decide they're going to go on and fully role play their characters, and never actually act on it, and never be willing to risk the consequences of being a disobedient slave, right? Like that's like, yeah. But yeah, the first time based scenario I really ran with this group after running D&D with them for well over a year, it took them it actually I had to remind them a couple times, like, okay, just so you all know, things are happening, and it's up to you to intersect yourself into things that are going on a timeline and become involved. Like this isn't necessarily, but there were scenario based things. I mean, again, to give them clues. The locations were to give them clues about the timeline that was going on. So it's actually like a pretty complex type of scenario to develop because, again, how do you intersect information? How do you organize the information? I mean, to me, a timeline is easy. Day one, this happens at this time. This happens at this time. This happens at this time. Like a storyboard or a script. A day two, this happens at this time. This happens at this time. This happens at his time. But then you have to decide like what clues am I going to give the players to interject them into this story, to give them this idea of intersection into this story. And that's what I find challenging. And as I said, I'm going to be really interested in running the couple scenarios I've run with groups to go to a convention and run them. Because I'll be curious to see if a group who has no clue about me or no clue about my style, no clue about the game or any of this to see how it's navigated. And I think that will tell me a lot as a game master and designer. I think I'll be able to figure out a lot from that. Last type of scenario, sandbox. I would argue this is the hardest thing. The hardest thing to run, to organize. And I think it depends what you think of in terms of a sandbox game and how much of it is actually sandbox versus things are triggered and discovered as the players move through a sandbox environment. And I think everybody here knows, but I mean, just in case we have a viewer here who doesn't know, or a viewer later who doesn't know, sandbox means it's an open world. That there might not be, that the characters are almost expected to help integrate their characters into the environment and maybe even develop stories as they move through the environment. Now, in ye olde days of high school and early college, when I had much more time to game, and I had a group of friends, including Blake, who I don't know if Blake popped in tonight or not, but and other people, where I would just sit out a map of the city that they were in and let their characters just wander around. And I would make things up and respond to it. Now, again, this is a group that we had been playing at that time 3 or 4 years steadily together with many of the same characters. So it was extremely easy to do that sort of scenario with that group. As I've mentioned before, there was a heavy sandbox element to the Wild West Cthulhu game, especially after the very orchestrated prelude that was all event and time based. And I found that very difficult to run and keep on track. And in fact, in the end, I had to kind of pull it back and give them more direct focused clues. And I think that's where I think that really helped inform me when running the current Tales scenario, which could also run the risk of being very open, of saying, okay, there are these really focused clues. The players really are going to need to have, especially in a world that they don't know, in a city that is effectively alien to them. Everything from the geography and the layout to the customs and the cultures. This had to be something where there was a lot more guidance, where they had to really be given ideas. And there are a couple points that even if you watch the playthrough, and again, if you plan to play this scenario, I don't necessarily advise it, but feel free to watch the playthrough, where I pull back and I explain the greater kind of climate around the conversation, the situation that they're in. Because I feel their characters would know it. They as players won't know it, but as characters, their characters would know. And that's what I've got for tonight. Any thoughts? Any more thoughts? Great thoughts. Great conversation. Again, that's why I'm here doing this. Especially the tavern chats. If anyone has any thoughts that they want to reflect on as far as sandbox tends to be really difficult. Well, and that's where I think you have to have those hooks in place, and you have to be absolutely ready to respond fluidly to those hooks. But you also have to have players who want to do that. And again, you do kind of start to get a feel. Certain groups really want the adventure and they want you to narrate and they want to respond. They want it to be reactive instead of necessarily that proactive. Or if they're proactive, they want more agency over the environment than what you're really wanting to do. Yeah, and I think that's why, to be honest, Heart was really difficult for me to grasp, because we also played a short form of it where that doesn't become as evident. And again, not that I didn't think it was interesting, but I thought it was interesting. And I was kind of like interesting in the way, like I said, watching a surrealist film is interesting. Not necessarily that that I thought it was bad. It was just like I was having trouble kind of grasping what exactly was going on and how it was being motivated and organized in terms of the scenario, the information delivery. I mean, that's kind of what I'm talking about this whole night, and that's a great callback. That what I'm talking about here entirely is information delivery. Is how you deliver this information to the players, and how is story and RPG scenario information delivered to players. And the way you construct your scenario using these roughly 4 basic guidelines that I've kind of arbitrarily come up with over the past couple weeks of writing. How do you organize that? And how do you get players to deliver it and access it? And then it becomes very character centric, which is cool. And I always go back to the thought of, well, with the right group and a small group, that's really easy. But if you had 8 people around a table, a game like Heart, where things were very individually character beat driven, would become extremely difficult to manage. Now, again, I know everybody says, well, I can't even get 3 people together. How do you get 8 people? And like I said, I've had 7 around the game table when the group was in full swing about 1.5 years ago to 2 years ago. Yeah, 8 people would be murderous for a game like that, especially. For D&D, it was hard enough. 7 people was rough enough. It was rough enough. Just actual group, like physical organization and talking over people. You can't expect people to sit there like mummies at the table. It's difficult enough to just for the communication aspect. And again, it's much easier when you have the Knoll army. The Knoll army's coming. What's everyone doing? You have 8 people who all are going to do things to help defeat the Knoll army or whatever. Knoll warband. Well, it was the Knoll army. They didn't defeat it, they ran from it, which they were supposed to do. Oh, absolutely. In ye old days, having 6 to 8 people. I mean, it's even weird. Like, anytime I've posted about running Call of Cthulhu, it's one of those games due to its, quite, pun intended, cult following. I've gotten like really random people like message me and be like, "Oh, is this online or in person?" I'm like, "Oh, it's in person." Like, too bad. And at one point, I basically had to turn people away from my D&D game because it was a case where somebody told a mutual friend of all of ours about it, and that person and her husband really wanted to play D&D, and I was like, we have too many people. We have too many people, especially for 2 new people who I'm not sure if they're even going to enjoy this or stick with this, and that we're going to have to schedule around. We have to schedule around 6 people now. And by the way, I always see the joke, I'd like to play D&D, but only if it's between this time next Thursday. The remedy for that is just setting the time for the game, and people who show up, show up. People who want to show up, show up. Yeah, so we generally now we have four in me for this tail session, and honestly, that's okay by me for now. Especially for this game, which is a different game. While it's a fantasy game, it is not a group let's go kill a dragon game. There is a lot more role playing. There is a lot more social interaction. There is a lot more atmosphere. To me, it's more like playing a White Wolf game where maybe 4 is the sweet spot, 3 to 4. I like 4. And the reason why I also like 4 is let's say one person just can't make it one week, but we really want to progress the story and everybody's fine with it. It's easier to do it with 3 1 down than 4 1 down than 3 1 down. Because then 2 players, you are kind of like, all right, then there's 2 people making the decision. Which again, sometimes some games that works fine. I've run Vampire for 2 people plenty of times and played with just one other person, and that's fine. Especially if you're playing like old characters or whatever, and you can just do whatever you want. But again, a game like Heart, I think optimally 3 players is probably if it's going to become really beat driven, or any of the newer games that are more story beat driven and are really based around individual character makeup. I think it absolutely is probably easier to have 3 to 4 people than 6 or 8. Well, Senator being energetic chat, guys. Thanks. I thought that this was going to be a kind of quiet one. I didn't expect a lot of people to show up because it is now. Now, of course, all the people who showed up are avid gamers, game masters, read a lot of games. It's much less of folks who kind of showed up for the last few weeks who were also very interested in hearing about the folklore, which was absolutely fine because that's why I did it, especially around Halloween time. I was like, all right, let's have a ghouls and ghosts, episode, and then the previous week I had the broad religion, which actually is the highest attended chat ever, except maybe the one on race. I think the one on character races was really highly attended. Next week is going to be special. It's kind of the idea I've been having going forward for a while. We're going to have a guest. She'll be here live in person with me for a couple days visiting. Rhiannon Zlark, Alyssa Eager from Rhiannon Zlark will be here. She has been on the gaming and convention circuit for a number of years now. In addition, she's been on kind of the folk festival and Filk festival and pagan circuit for a while, doing she's been involved in various projects, but her core project is Rhiannon's Lark, which is her with a variety of different types of musical expression, voice and guitar, occasionally something else. I have done a guest bagpipe on one of her albums, and I've done a couple bits here and there as far as just fun collaboration with her. And we're also going to be working on a video for something, a fun gaming geek oriented video song while she's here. But she's going to come on and talk a little bit about her experiences in the circuit, in the gaming circuit, in the con circuit as a performer. And maybe she'll even do a couple songs for us. Maybe. probably have the owl cam on. I don't know. I'll have to see how it works. I don't know if it'll be easier to do just this and maybe a webcam on me, and then the nicer cam on her. And then we'll be owl camming it. Well, she'll be here Wednesday earlier, so we'll have a little bit of time to test it. But it should be fun, and I'm hoping it'll be a big turnout. And I'm kind of going towards this idea of, especially occasionally doing a chat. How and a cat, it'll probably turn into a cat and dog cam because I'll probably be very curious as to why this person's playing guitar and singing in my living room or wherever we decide to do this at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. It'll throw off their little worlds. There'll be probably cat and dog heads appearing in the video. Occasionally a dog howling at her. Very interactive. So I think it'll be fun. And I'm already talked to a few other people down the road about possibly guesting either virtually or arranging something in person for this. Because I think it could start to become something more than what it has been up until now. Though, of course, the core of it's still going to be the progress on Tales of the Hard Land and the playthroughs. And I'm not sure how the group feels about a live stream game. There was definitely a little bit of reticence, but this week when you guys see or whoever does choose to watch the playthrough of this week's game session, everybody really presents on camera. Now that they've seen it and they're more aware of how it acts, like the presentation level, unintentionally, except for a really annoying light flare that I didn't catch until we were all done. I saw the source of it today. It was the light reflecting off a window. So there's a big glow in Mel's camera most of the time. It does not, for the most part, obstruct the experience. But it was annoying when I went back and watched the video the next morning. I was like, oh, there's a light blob I didn't see. So next week we're gonna have to close all the shades and all that stuff for 2 weeks whenever we play next. Well, if anyone's got anything else, feel free to share. Thanks a lot for coming on. I'll be on my usual time tomorrow, probably maybe a little closer to noon for a couple hours doing some writing. I think I'm going to be prepping for PAX. Another big announcement. I will be at PAX Unplugged, which most of you here know that, but I've been waiting to get some confirmations in and get some more information. But I do have Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, and Friday night running in the unpublished game, indie game area. Running Tales of the Hard Land. So that'll be exciting. I think maybe tomorrow I'm going to start prepping a little bit of material for that. Because I kind of had that moment of panic of yesterday going, wow, that's a week away. That's a month away. That needs to be really done. Like really, really done. Like all the playtest characters have to be updated. All the pre-gen characters have to be updated to current specifications, all that kind of stuff. All right, friends. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming on and chatting. Thanks for all the good input. Some cool stuff. And thanks for Curzon for the thoughts on the topic when we were chatting the other day. And Neil for suggesting the fun of sandbox games, which again, all of these individually could be our own topic. Yeah, I got my J.J. Abrams lens flare going, and I love it just as much as I do when J.J. Abrams does it. Let me tell you. I'm like, what is wrong with Mel's face? Oh, there's at first I thought there was a smudge on the lens. But I think there was a lot of light refraction because even I look kind of diffused because I have the one light next to me and I think it diffused a lot. That's fine. So as usual, thanks for tuning in. Twitch TV from the Tomes. YouTube, Fox and Board Games. At Fox and Board Games. A lot of cool stuff has appeared there. And I hope more shall appear soon. foxandboardgames.com. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Fox and Board Games. Thanks everyone for coming and chatting and lurking and watching this later and liking and subscribing and following. Don't hesitate to jump on and say hello when I'm online, or just stop by and see what I'm up to. Thank you all very much. Have a good night.